Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ESU Happy Hour. Today's presentation is Victory at Sea, an in-depth exploration of the unique role of US-led naval power during World War II with Professor Paul Kennedy. My name is Elizabeth Bigelow, and I am the manager of branch services at the English-Speaking Union of the United States. So first tonight, I would like to give a big thank you to the Boston branch as they're sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Please note that ideas for our happy hour lectures come from our ESU members and viewers like you. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey in your email where you are encouraged to share your feedback on tonight's lecture. You are also welcome to give us ideas for any upcoming happy hour lectures. Some other notes about tonight's presentation. The lecture by Professor Kennedy will be directly followed by a 10-minute question and answer session between Professor Kennedy and George Missoui. There will be some intriguing points brought to light during this session, so feel free to submit your own questions during this time. After Professor Kennedy and Mr. Missoui speak, there will be some time for audience questions. You may also submit any questions at any time during the lecture using the dedicated Q&A and chat modules at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please note that questions will be answered in the order they are received. I'm happy to say that tonight we have over 200 people registered for this program. And I would also like to give a shout out to the branches with the most registered members tonight. Those branches are Central Florida, Greenwich, and New Orleans. And finally, I would like to introduce David Herter of the Boston branch. He's on the board of directors of the ESU Boston branch, and he is also a proprietor of the Boston Athenaeum, where he moderates the World War I group. And now I will turn it over to David to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening. On behalf of the Boston branch of the English-Speaking Union, welcome to another ESU Happy Hour, the fourth which the Boston branch has been privileged to host. Our branch president, Paul Bogosian, who was instrumental in arranging these programs, also welcomes you, but is unable to attend because of a non-COVID illness. Get well soon, Paul. Tonight's guest, Professor Paul Kennedy, will actually be in Boston for a live event on November 22nd for ESU members and their guests. If you're in Boston, we would love to see you. On December 6th, the branch will host our annual holiday party with food, drink, music, and a performance from the winner of our Shakespeare contest. These happy hours were started during the pandemic when the branches could not hold live events, and have proven so popular that they will continue forward to promote ESU members, provide ESU members with connections to ideas and each other. A special thank you also goes to the Happy Hour Committee for their work, and particularly Chairwoman Karen Blair Brown, without whom these programs would not be possible. Paul Kennedy is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History and Director of International Security Studies at Yale University. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books. His best-known work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, provoked intense debate on its publication 35 years ago and has been translated into more than 20 languages. In his new book, Victory at Sea, Professor Kennedy charts the rise and fall of the Allied and Axis navies during World War II, and shows how the strategies for naval warfare were completely altered between 1936 and 1946. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Paul Kennedy to the ESU Happy Hour.
I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you for doing me the honor of inviting me to this session. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the book Victory at Sea will be for the older members of this viewers. It will have a resonance as you scramble in your brains to say, well, wasn't there a really successful US television series of many segments called Victory at Sea, in black and white, shown of photos and coverage of the war, especially in the Pacific, partly in the Atlantic, in the 1950s. And indeed, that is true. The music by Richard Rodgers, the wonderful sort of scenes of the gray whipping clouds around the warships of Victory at Sea. The idea of giving a fresh, a repeat of that title for this book came to me late in the day as I wondered what it was that I should do to describe in a simple way the project I've been working on for the past 6 or 8 years. The photograph, it seems to you, a photograph of a warship in action on the front cover of Victory at Sea, which you have here, is none other than one of the 54 really dramatic and wonderful original paintings of the marine artist Ian Marshall. Ian Marshall is alas no longer with us. He died of a heart attack stroke in his home, in his studio, just a few years ago. But already by then, he had been working with me to produce a set of illustrations about warships and conflict at sea, which could be married with my own interest in how the Second World War was the conflict which brings the United States to be the #1 power in world affairs and sees to the transformation of navies themselves by 1946. So it is with great pleasure that I talk to you tonight for the next 25 minutes or so about this book of mine, Victory at Sea, with the subtitle, Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, with paintings by Ian Marshall. Ian's paintings, and we're going to show you just 3 or 4 of them, are imitative in many ways of the works of the great 19th century English landscape and marinescape artists Turner and Constable. In the foreground, there is something of a tension, like Flatford Mill or the Fighting Temeraire, or some other thing which you may be familiar with in those paintings of those artists. But in the background, there is this wonderful color scheme of cliffs, of waterways, of sky, of sunshine, maybe of storms coming and whipping their way up. This was, I think, Ian Marshall's inspiration, but he was also an artist and a historian in his own right of books on armored warfare, armored craft of the 19th century, of passages to India and Indian Ocean liners going through the Suez Canal to India, of flying boats, of which he did a wonderful book. And it was with some delight I realized Ian had become a friend of mine about 8 or 9 years ago, but he was doing a set of paintings on aircraft carriers and the Second World War, which then, over a long story, and which I won't go into you now, turned out to be lead to his paintings of all sorts of warships of the Second World War, which could be then used as the illustrative material for a new single volume history of the war at sea, of Victory at Sea. The Second World War story of navies and sea power is interesting to me, ladies and gentlemen, because it is the story of no less than 6 nations who have large and medium to large size navies as war breaks out in 1939. There are the very, very large navies of Imperial Japan, of the Royal Navy of the British Empire, and of the United States Navy, but there are also really considerable navy of France, of Italy, with perhaps the most elegant warships in the world, and of the rising but still behind forces of the Nazi Navy as a contender. And therefore, the story of sea power in the Second World War is not one just of American and Japanese navies in the Pacific. It is a story of navies contesting command of the sea in the Atlantic, especially in the 6-year-long struggle of the convoys, but also some of the individual raids by the large German warships like the Bismarck and the Graf Spee. It's also a story of the incredibly bitterly fought convoy battles and some other attacks and battles in the Mediterranean itself. This is a war in the Mediterranean for sea power control, in the Pacific for sea power control, and in the Atlantic for sea power control. At the very end of the story, it's true. One very, very large fleet, one very, very large navy has emerged with a secondary navy, an allied navy, of course, the Royal Navy alongside it, but falling away in size just because of the enormous surge in the productive shipbuilding capacities of the United States. So there's 6 long years of naval war in this work, which we're going to show you the frontispiece now of the book once again, if Laura can do it for me, if you get that prompt. And the first part of the book, ladies and gentlemen, is one with chapters prompted by an old friend of mine living in Norwich, England, who said that, you know, many people will need a chapter called Navies and Ships of 1939 to describe exactly what it is, what we're dealing with. These navies of the time are complicated groups of different sorts of warships, of aircraft carriers on the one hand, of submarine forces on the other hand, of the largest of the surface fighting ships or battleships, of heavy and light cruisers, of escort ships like destroyers and frigates. All of these should be described for the reader, Professor Kennedy, and you should try to assess the relative size of these navies and of their shipbuilding capacities. And then maybe you should also have a chapter about the geographical dimension and the economic dimension of the backdrop to the story. But those of you interested in the story of the war at sea itself will probably go directly to chapter 4, which is on the war at sea as it breaks out in Europe in 1939 to 1940. A war fought both at sea and in the air because of the triumph of the Luftwaffe in doing such damage to the Royal Navy and its sea power that Germany was able not only to knock out France from contesting in the war, but to take over most of Western Europe, including the valuable ports of Norway, and to drive the British Army out of France and make them pull out of Europe in the excavation at Dunkirk. And chapter 5 and 6, which will be on the wars in the Mediterranean, as well as in the Atlantic, until Japan attacks not just the American positions, but also the British and Dutch positions in December 1941, and brings the war to be a total or a global war. This is a book which says little about the Soviet or the Russian Navy, because they're not really contenders for the battle of the big oceans in the war itself, though they do escort in the convoys which arrive in North Russia. The war is to be fought by the height of the conflict itself in 3 major zones of struggle. In the Middle Sea, in the Mediterranean, all through 41 and 42, until the defeat of Italy and the surrender of the Italian Navy late in the year in 1943, in the long, long tussle, the longest battle of all naval terms during the Second World War is the battle for control of the Atlantic sea lanes, the Battle of the Atlantic. And then from December 1941 until the dropping of the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender, the Battle of the Pacific. The Battle of the Pacific is told in chapter 8, in chapter 6, I beg your pardon, going into chapter 7, and it resumes again for 1944 and 1945 in chapters 9 and chapter 10. The middle part, the central part of this book on victory at sea, naval power and the transformation of the global order are the linked chapters 7 and 8 dealing with the critical year of 1943. Why is it, I argue, that 1943 is so important? 43 sees the height of the conflicts occurring and the eventual victory of the Allied escort navies with their radar systems and long-range air patrols in the Battle of the Atlantic. 43 sees the end of the struggle in the Battle of the Mediterranean, and 43 at the very end of it sees the beginnings of this broad advance of the Southwest Pacific fleets and the Central Pacific fleets across the Pacific. But chapter 7, dealing with this transformation and the alteration in the naval weights in the fighting story, is accompanied by a chapter 8, which has no paintings by Ian Marshall in it. It has no sense of battles and conflicts. It is a look at the shift in the underlying productive balances that occurs in that year, which makes the United States the virtually inevitable victor of the Second World War. It can be portrayed in naval terms, of course, if I remind you that in late May 1943, the United States Navy had only one single aircraft carrier left in the Pacific, the veteran, the Saratoga. But it's at the very beginning of June 1943 that Admiral Nimitz may be looking out of his windows at his headquarters building in Pearl Harbor, would witness the arrival of the very first of the new Essex-class American fast fleet aircraft carriers. And if the USS Essex was the first to arrive, within another month came the second one, and then the third one, and then the fourth one, in such rapidity, ladies and gentlemen, that by the time the US Navy started its recovery conquest of, say, the Marianas and the Marshall Islands in late 43 and early 44, it has 10 or 12 aircraft carriers. And the Japanese have lost their chance. They hold back, they do not push forward very much in 43, and by 44, I think the argument could fairly be made, the battle is over. It's a battle of productivity. It's a battle of shipbuilding. It's a battle of aircraft production as well as anything else. In 1942, the US produces somewhere like 20,000 aircraft. In 43, it's 40,000 aircraft. Can you imagine that? 40,000 planes. And in 1944, it is 84,000 or 96,000 aircraft. Nothing is able to withstand this. Aircraft squadrons can be flown across the Atlantic, across the Pacific to reinforce the admirals and the generals who need those aircraft in their struggles against Japan in the one theater and Germany in the other theater. Victory at sea is coming. The music of Richard Rodgers is there in the background. The paintings of Ian Hamilton are here. Ian Marshall, I beg your pardon, Ian Hamilton Marshall are here. But the underlying story is one that we also need to take account of as well. So I'm going, as I head towards the end of my remarks, or get closer towards the end of my remarks, to admit that this book, Victory at Sea, is a complicated book. It can be read, ladies and gentlemen, if you like, at different levels. If you are admirers of maritime art, if you have enjoyed looking at collections of paintings by other artists, Ian Marshall was, after all, president of the American Marine Artists Association, if you've looked at their paintings and now come along at his, you can cite his as being in a tradition of warship paintings. 53 of them, plus some sketches, are in this particular book. Yale University Press has done us the most wonderful service by having some of the paintings as a double spread in the book, but some of the paintings going all the way up to the margins to make the page look so much bigger, some of them being extraordinarily graphic. That exciting one of the battleship Bismarck trying to avoid the attacks of the swordfish aircraft, that first one there is a typical Ian Marshall painting. But then look at this next one as we think about the English-speaking Union. Let's go to the next picture there. Guess what this is? Even the naval historians stretching to look at this painting will wonder, what has Ian Marshall done here? This is 1938. It is set in the British naval base of Portsmouth. But it's not a British battleship there, is it, members of the English-speaking Union? It is not a British battleship there. It is the USS Texas. Now, of course, a famous museum ship down on the Texas coast. There is the Texas come to pay a goodwill visit to the Royal Navy and to the British in 1938. Maybe this is at the time of the Munich crisis, when Neville Chamberlain is attempting to cut his deal with Adolf Hitler. In the backdrop, there is a British light cruiser, a 6-inch or 4.9-inch light cruiser. The Texas will be one of those whose story is then to be told, of course, at Pearl Harbor, then to be resuscitated. The Texas plays a great role as a bombardment battleship in various campaigns in the Second World War, survives the war, and is now part of our naval heritage. This is beautifully captured. Ian Marshall had a researcher in London who would go and investigate contemporary newspaper photographs of what has happened, get the detail right. Let's see maybe if you can look at one or two other of his paintings now. This is another one for members of the English-speaking Union, especially the Anglo-American Alliance. I had not known this story, but at the very end of the war in Europe, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, after President Truman had gone in his long journey over to Potsdam to negotiate with Stalin and with Churchill, and then Churchill's successor, Attlee, the end of the war in Europe to do the European settlement. President Truman then flies back to the UK, gets on a train which takes him down to Portsmouth Harbor, and there has 2 nights in Anglo-American Alliance solidarity of lunches and dinner on these 2 great warships, in which King George VI himself comes and has Truman as his guest of honor at a dinner on this most wonderful of the British fast 15-inch gun battle cruisers, HMS Renown, until Truman goes, inviting the king to have a meal, of course, on the American warship USS Augusta, the presidential heavy cruiser. And then at the end of these celebrations, at the very beginning days of August 1945, the Augusta turns and steams out of the British harbor across the Atlantic, bearing the leader of the free world back home. And it's during those 4 days and nights of the Augusta's crossing of the Atlantic that Truman signs the final order for the dropping of the atomic bombs upon Japan. This will occur just before he arrives back in American waters and goes to deliver his address to the US Congress. And so symbolically here you see the British battle cruiser and the American heavy cruiser at the very end of a war, celebrating all of the struggle. I give in detail in the book the many campaigns in which the HMS Renown was present and played a vital role, and the many areas in which the Augusta had been there, both as a bombardment ship, but also as taking American presidents, FDR and Truman, to one meeting of the big three or the big four after another. I wonder if there's could it possibly be a better painting by Ian Marshall of the Anglo-American Naval Union than that original painting of his? Is there anything else, Laura, we have to show in this set of paintings? Aha. Again, let's have the Navy buffs stretching forward here, ladies and gentlemen. Where is the location of this beautiful Ian Marshall painting? It's in a harbor. The sun is setting at the far end of the bay. Yes, it is Tokyo Bay. Yes, that is Mount Fuji, the reverend and sacred mountain of the Japanese. Yes, there is that great American battleship Missouri on which the documents of surrender were signed. Yes, there are American Essex-class aircraft carriers and American battleships in the background. And on the right-hand side, typical of Ian Marshall, he gets in a King George V class battleship to remind us that it was the Allied navies which had been there in Tokyo Harbor for the signing of the Japanese surrender for the end of the war in the Pacific. So this is what your author, Paul Kennedy, had most fun in doing, in trying to write a history, a story of the war at sea, in trying to write the story of victory at sea, but to wrap my text around the many wonderful paintings of Ian Marshall, and in addition to slip in a chapter about the sheer economic, technical, industrial shift in the power balances in chapter 8 of this book, which help us to understand why the Second World War was not just a war of battles of rival navies, like, say, the naval battles of the War of Austrian Succession in the 18th century. It was one of the great transformative, hegemonic wars of all time. I wonder how much longer I have in my remarks before George wishes to come in his introduction. Please remind me. I get no reply here, ladies and gentlemen. So since I know that my adept manipulator of illustrations is with me, let us push on to the map and the statistical table as being one other part of this book. In my various works, like my book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, I've tried always to give for the reader some sense of massive numbers, massive statistical evidence of the way world history is changing. And so in this particular work, also Victory at Sea, along with the paintings, along with the narrative of the story, I include a number of tables, a number of statistical graphs, a number of projections, which show the shifting industrial, shipbuilding, aircraft carrier, and GDP relative economic weight aspects of the story here. This particular chart 8 is of a ratio of a GDP between the Allied and Axis powers between the year 1938, that final year of peace in the interwar years, and 1945. You can see that with the decline and elimination of France, but by 1940, actually, the gross domestic product of the Allied forces together has dipped in relation to the total GDP of the Axis powers. But you will also see that as the war continues, and in particular, as 1942 goes to 43 and to 44, here we have in this graphic term, another indication of something significant which is happening in the background power balances. This is because of military production, the industrial output, the shipbuilding and aircraft and tank production output of the United States is allowing the Allied proportion to the Axis proportion to totally be changed, of course, to the advantage of the Allies by 44 going into 1945. And then there are maps. It's really wrong, I think. I don't know what people in the audience will say to this one, but it's really wrong, I think, to offer a work of history, especially a large, sprawling history of, say, the Second World War, and not to have maps of the geography, of the routes, of the relative place of the different countries in for the reader's benefit again and again and again. And maps, of course, can do many different things. This is one of the lovely additional and original maps of the artist, the map artist, Mr. Wilson, which we asked him to do to try to capture the route of the giant battleship Bismarck as it leaves its German ports, as it goes up to the ports in Western Norway and then sails out into its conflict to contest the seas against the Royal Navy, to sink the giant battlecruiser Hood, and then to be, after detection, to be damaged in its rudders so that it cannot race back to the safety of the French harbors, and for the Royal Navy to catch up with it and surround it. So that illustration on the front of the book, which we showed you as the first illustration here accompanying tonight's talk, there you see the Ian Marshall capturing a mid-cut portion of the Bismarck at sea in the heavy waters of the Atlantic. If you peer very, very carefully, you can see two minute aircraft scudding in the water, having tried to drop their torpedoes to try to slow down the Bismarck and give the Royal Navy the chance to catch up with it. This epic story takes a turn for the worse for the German admiral, a turn for the better for Churchill and his Navy, because one of the torpedoes dropped by those small string bag biplane torpedo aircraft of the carrier Victorious, one of those torpedoes manages to hit the steering rudder of this giant battleship, and in hitting it to prevent it from being able to move left and right as a rudder should do, to make the rudder firm and unmoving so that the ship cannot get mobility at sea. It can only twist and turn in circles and await its fate. So with this book, you have wonderful illustrations of Ian Marshall. You have the epic stories of the Bismarck and many of the other warships which went out to contest the Allied victory in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. and then a different story indeed, illustrated also by the paintings of Ian Marshall of the Japanese battleships and of the aircraft carriers in the Battle of the Pacific, especially as we come along into chapters 8, 1942, chapter 7, 1943, and then even more than that, in the Battle of the Pacific, chapters 9 and 10 in 1944 and 1945. In all of those chapters, there have to be the background statistical tables of numbers of warships, numbers of product, and even more important to the reader, the variety of maps of the American campaign routes across the Pacific from 1944 to 1945, maps of the plans of the eventual landings and amphibious landings and campaign for the overrunning of Japan itself in 1945 going into 1946. It's a battle of navies against navies work. It's a book about power shifts. It's a book trying to capture what a very fine marine artist can do when asked to recollect for the readers the very stirring scenes of what happens. Large ships, small ships, amphibious ships, bombardment ships, submarines of the German Navy, submarines of the US Navy, stalking, say, an unsuspecting giant Japanese aircraft carrier and sinking it near the end of the war. I hope that the members of the English-speaking Union will just enjoy this as it is. It's meant to be a book which you can pick up and read for a chapter or two, and then put down if you wish, and then pick up on a following night. I have to say, of the various books I've written, ladies and gentlemen, it is the one which, despite my sadness at the passing of Ian Marshall himself, it's the one which gave me a very great amount of pleasure to write and to put together in these past few years. And I'm happy that it can be the subject of this particular meeting of the ESU. And I look forward to the comments and to questions and to discussion further this evening as we have our happy hour. Thank you so much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Kennedy. And once again, I would like to turn it over to David Herter, who will next introduce George Missouri.
Thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. And you did manage to convey your joy at the book to the audience. Thank you again.
Thank you.
George Missouri has degrees in linguistics from Harvard and Columbia Universities, specializing in Altaic and Uralic linguistics. He is the co-author of Encounter English, a home study course for English as a foreign language, published by the Encyclopedia Britannica, as well as his word, Obscure Studies in Linguistics. Since his retirement 20 years ago, he has taught adult education courses for Beacon Hill seminars in Boston, mostly thematic histories such as the history of theater, the history of warfare, etc. Weather permitting, he sails the waters of New England. George, we're now with you.
Thank you, David. Very much appreciate that introduction. And I'm honored to be here to ask some questions of Professor Kennedy. And of course, there's the book. The illustrations that were shown on screen, by the way, I think did no justice to the quality of the illustrations you actually see in the book. They are truly wonderful illustrations. In fact, my first question is on the subject of these illustrations. Professor Kennedy, did you find that the illustrations in some ways better told the story than photographs might have?
Oh, very much so. There was a certain stage when one of the copy editors for the book said, are we not going to have photographs as well as illustrations? And this was very swiftly turned down by the larger powers that be. They could see the attractiveness of having this book without black or white photographs, or without an alternative idea, a cluster of photographs put together, as it were, in the middle pages of the book. The book might have been produced by one of my large trade publishers in New York. You can guess the names of those giant publishers there, but very few of them showed any interest at all in doing what Yale University Press saw it could do, which is to take these wonderful original paintings of Ian Marshall and give them a superb treatment by laminating all of the colors. The reason why the book is so heavy, as I think you know, is that the paintings in these are all delicately laminated with the primal colors, first of all, and then brought together. I've often challenged people in the past few months to hold the book in their hands and to give a guess as to what the weight of the book is. It comes in some guesses is about 3.5 pounds. I think it is rather more like 4.1 pounds. And that's because of the heavy weight of the painted illustrations in the book itself. But it is much, much better thing as has emerged now, because we actually did not go for photographs.
No, I agree with you. I think that worked very, very well. Okay. And so one of the other things that struck me about your book was that it was, unlike many histories which seem to revolve around great men or heroic figures or evildoers or Lord knows what, you bring very few personalities into play in your book. So is this a conscious pattern in your writing in general, or a general belief that you have about history?
It is a conscious pattern in my writings in general, going back to maybe a book of mine many years ago called British Naval Mastery, which was less to do with Admiral Nelson and Admiral Blake and Jackie Fisher, and more to do with the story of how and why it was that Great Britain over 300 or 400 years became the largest, most preeminent sea power until it declines in the 20th century. Best known, I suppose, in that work of mine, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, full of statistical tables with very, very few paragraphs dealing with individuals in the larger scheme of history. I have to say, though, at the very end of this book, Victory at Sea, I did want to come back to the fact that for all of the statistical tables that I produce, for all of my emphasis upon the shift in the gigantic weights of productivity revolution and gross domestic product of the United States, these wars at sea in the Mediterranean, Pacific, and Atlantic, and the Arctic convoys, these wars at sea are fought by individual sailors. They're fought by crews. They're fought by the commanders and bosuns of small ships in long journeys across the Pacific. They're fought by the divers of American dive bombing aircraft, which destroyed Japanese aircraft carriers in 1942 and 43. There is a personal story, there is a personal dedication, but my overall tilt is to try to tell the story from the larger, if you like, bird's eye view.
Well, actually, it brings up another question I had, which was, there was a friend of mine who was a political consultant. And one thing he always told his clients was, don't use numbers because it will frighten people. Were you ever afraid that all these statistics might frighten your readers?
Look, if you go back to that book I referenced before, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, it is laden, overladen, you might say, with statistical tables, because they're meant there to reinforce the big argument in the book of 500 years of world history. What I've tried to do here, and I'd be interested in whether the reader thinks I've succeeded, is to produce a book which on the one hand has, I hope, a fair flowing narrative of the campaigns at sea, along with the 54 wonderful paintings of Ian Marshall and the very, very fine maps, illustrative geographical sketches of Mr. Wilson, along with some statistics when they are needed. I try to use statistics as little as possible, but as much as I necessarily felt should be there to give the larger story of a book.
Okay.
Statistics, paintings, and geographical sketches, and a narrative. I tried to put all four together in this particular work.
That's very well done, I must admit. Of course, I'm not afraid of numbers, so I enjoyed that part of it, actually. But I have my other question, last question, I think, is could your book have been entitled Victory in the Air instead of Victory at Sea?
It would have been to the utter amazement and acute disappointment of Ian Marshall, the great painter of warships and ocean liners and armored ships, whatever. He did once, as I mentioned before, a wonderful book on long distance flying boats, but no, this was not a victory in the air, it was a victory at sea. Although it's fair enough to say that in the latter stages of the war, in the fight against the U-boats on the one hand in the North Atlantic, or in the struggles at, say, the great battles in the Western Pacific, air power and carrier air power become conjoint with naval power. By the end of the war, the United States Navy in the Western Pacific is a ship air force of power, not just a force of warships. It is not the US Navy of 1919 or the US Navy of the Spanish-American War. It is a Navy in which carrier air power lead the way, lead the front, with all of the other ships surrounding.
Well, thank you, Professor Kennedy. I think I really enjoyed the book and I enjoyed chatting with you. I will now return this to Elizabeth, who will now moderate some questions from the general audience. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, my pleasure.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. We have a number of questions that have come in. So thank you all for those of you who have already sent in questions. I do want to make a note that we love the enthusiasm. There are some people who sent in more than one question. So I do want to make sure that we get through as many questions from as many people as possible. So I'm going to start with a round and then I'm going to go around again. So our first question comes from Lee Purcell of the Colonial North Carolina branch. And he's wondering if during the time there were differences in mastery of diesel technology.
Well, the differences in mastery of diesel technology, as I hear it. The best sort of inventors and producers of diesel technology for warships at sea and for submarines at sea were undoubtedly the Germans themselves. Herr Diesel, his name would be the indicator of that. Herr Diesel would be very pleased that his form of production as an alternative to the regular form of piston engine, non-diesel form of ignition and then power transmission would have been turned so systematically and so cleverly by the Germans. The Germans not only have diesel driven engines in their submarines, of course, but they also have them in some of their longer range raiding warships, because The diesel will give you much greater radius in the capacity of your warship. It will give you a sort of regularity, which the piston, it will give you the regularity which the regular petrol-driven engines will not, or oil-driven petrol engines will not. They will not give you the high speed, although the Germans did produce very high speeds in some of their warships, but they will give you, they thought, some sorts of advantage over the Allies. I'm guessing too that there may be some of the other people coming in here can help. Was it because the German recognition that the Anglo-Americans have the greatest control of the petroleum resources of the world, and you want to use an economic form of production? So your first question tossed out in this general debate kind of throws me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right in thinking that the Germans themselves use diesel engine technology more and better than anybody else does. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Kennedy. Our next question comes from Charles Lumpkins. He's with the Central Pennsylvania branch, and he's wondering, how did American battleships compare to Japanese battleships in terms of armor, speed, and so forth?
Oh, this is a great naval buffs, a great debate, which if you fall amidst them, you'll discover that they will go on for ages and ages and ages. The big problem here is that there was not, as the admirals of each side hoped before 1941, there was not going to be a gigantic battle fleet against battle fleet pounding conflict in which the 16-inch missiles of the American fleet would crash down upon the Japanese warships, or the even 18-inch gun shells of the Japanese warships would come crashing down on the Americans. It's really for the battleship experts to tell us more of the story here. My thought is that the Japanese build a better battleship and a better battleship navy in the run up to the war itself. And therefore, had there been a conflict between Japanese and American battle fleets, if there had been a war in the Pacific somewhere west of Hawaii, 8 or 10 or 12 of the American warships against 10 or so of the Japanese warships with rather better optics, it's possible, I think, more than likely, that the Japanese would have done better, and many of the Japanese warships were indeed better armed. When the new American battleships, I think here not just of the North Carolina, Washington class, but of the Iowa class, when these new powerful, fast 16-inch gun battleships come into play, would they have done well if they'd been allowed to have a great dogfight? 20 miles apart, 16-inch guns against 18-inch guns against the Yamato class Musashi of the Japanese Navy. I think, who knows, by that stage, there's something new to be introduced. Thanks to the advances of radar and gunfire radar technology developed by the British in the early half of the year, then the US Navy itself has radar-controlled heavy guns in its battleships from 1943 onwards. And indeed, in one of the nighttime encounters, the USS Washington dispatches a Japanese major warship at night because it has radar and the other side has not. The great Allied advantage of radar comes through again and again in the war, in the fights of, say, the Battle of the North Cape or the Bismarck chase. but it's also there increasingly, or would be there increasingly, were there to have been this great fight between the American giant battle fleets and the Japanese battle fleet. Naval buffs are so sorry that it didn't happen. Many of the mothers of the sailors must have been very delighted that it did not happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Our next question comes from John Hooper. He is wondering, in your book, do you spotlight the roles and contributions of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Free French Naval Forces, and the Polish Navy during the Battle of the Atlantic? And if so, how are they juxtaposed with the Royal Navy?
All those three smaller navies, the Free French Navy, the Polish Navy, which of course have been almost destroyed, apart from some of their warships escaping in 1939, and the Royal Canadian Navy are smallish naval forces in the early stages of the war. Almost all of them need to rely upon the transfer of frigates, sloops, destroyers into their navy and then to be reflagged as Free French warships or as Royal Polish Navy warships. Canada had so disarmed and kept itself away from a rearmament policy under the long political leadership of Mackenzie King that the Canadian Navy was for all of the history of the Canadian Navy and its role in the Battle of the Atlantic in the First World War. The Canadian Navy in 1939, 40, 41 is very, very small indeed, with ships which are underpowered and with a very, very small personnel base. So the great expansion of the Canadian Navy, both in terms of personnel and the number of ships it has, escort ships, destroyers, frigates, sloops, corvettes, and its contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic is going to come chiefly from 1942 and 1943 onwards. By the very end of the war, this Royal Canadian Navy, in counting the number of ships it has, is a most substantial one. And it takes over, therefore, increasingly from the Royal Navy, those patrol duties in the western side of the Atlantic, and steps in where a US Navy is really not so much interested in the Battle of the Atlantic because it wishes most of its ships to go off and fight the Japanese in the Pacific. The Free French Navies have to play a role because Churchill wants symbolically to show his support of de Gaulle. And if you look at the composition of the escort fleets of some of the Allied convoys or of the support warships around in the D-Day landings, there you will see Royal Canadian warships, you will see Free French warships, and you will see Polish warships. The Polish destroyer is the one which is finally there trying to shoot and kill off the giant German battle cruiser, the Scharnhorst, in the Battle of the North Cape. Where the Polish Navy can be brought into underneath the umbrella of and work with the Royal Navy, it does so. It's fair to say that the Polish Air Force contributions in the Second World War are probably more substantial than the naval ones because the British give Polish squadrons, Polish flyers, so many aircraft that they can have their own Spitfire squadrons, Mosquito squadrons, Beaufighter squadrons, and long-range bomber squadrons. So there is a role to be played. It comes in the second half of the war, and it's in the supporting role because no one is talking about giant aircraft carriers or battleships for those three navies. But thank you for your nice question.
Alrighty, thank you, Professor Kennedy. This is our last question of the night. It comes from Dean Gamanas of the Greenwich branch. The question is, the production of 4 US aircraft carriers that you mentioned is truly remarkable. What do you attribute to this production? Was there any particular person or reason?
There's been a big debate about to whom should we give the credit, let's put it that way, for the enormous explosion of American output of warships and aircraft and many other things in the Second World War. There are some authors who say it was, of course, the American capitalist system which did it. It was American gigantic firms which did it. But in fact, I think as much credit, if not more, should be given to the planners of the New Deal and should be given to the particular bureaus of the US Navy as they thought this through. How do we go from the Navy size of peacetime to a much, much bigger Navy of wartime, especially in the newer sorts of craft like aircraft carriers? As the United States enters the war, damaged though it be from the attacks on Pearl Harbor, it still has a really significant shipbuilding industry. Some of the shipyards are government owned. That's a strategic policy made by the government for years and years beforehand. Other of the shipyards are the shipyards of giant steel and industrial combines. The US Navy is very careful to share the orders of new shipbuilding as between the state shipyards and the private shipyards. It's also very careful to ask Congress not just give us, 26 new aircraft carriers of the Essex class, but also give us additional money so we can go to the shipyard owners and offer money for new berths, for new engineering plants, for new recruitment of workers. So we can create the gigantic background resources necessary for putting these great aircraft carrier fleets together and the battleship and the heavy cruiser fleets as well. It's a combination of all sorts of types of industry and all categories of the military industrial complex. And I don't think that there is a single genius here. I think over time, the planners in Washington and some of the people in the New Deal administration could see that what they needed to do was an integrated policy for large-scale shipyard building. Thanks for a wonderful question. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Kennedy. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the ESU's Executive Director, Karen Karpowicz, to close us out for the night.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Kennedy. It was particularly interesting to me because I was the daughter of a man who worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and was on a destroyer escort during World War II. So all of that was part of my experiences growing up, all of that talk and language. My father would have loved to have seen those sketches. They are absolutely beautiful, and wrapping your history around them made them particularly special. I also want to thank George Mazzoli and David Herder from our Boston branch, and also Paul Bogosian. Paul, please feel better. And I would just like to remind everybody that of the English-speaking Union's gala on October the 3rd with the Princess Royal in New York City. It is sold out, but there are virtual tickets available. So if you'd like to join us virtually, please do. And then our annual general meeting and conference in Charleston, South Carolina, on the weekend, on Veterans Day weekend, November 11th through the 13th. So please join us again. And if you're not a member of the English-speaking Union, we are a membership organization, and I encourage you to become one. Thank you again, and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.